Good evening, everyone. My name is Araceli Marquez, and today I will be presenting on the topic of synthetic chemicals and how they pose a threat to children. I will be sharing an introduction, background, discuss some socioeconomic factors that impact this issue, share some of the synthetic chemicals that children are currently exposed to, and some interventions and strategies to address this issue. Exposure to environmental chemicals has existed for decades, but new synthetic chemicals are raising concerns in modern society. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, approximately 1,500 new chemicals are manufactured or imported every year. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, with over 80,000 chemical substances listed for use as of 2012. Many consumer products contain synthetic chemicals such as cleaning products, personal care products, building materials, furniture, electronics, food packaging, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, exposing people to these substances. Plastic toys could also consist of harmful synthetic chemicals that could be harmful to the health of children. Children are especially sensitive to toxic chemicals. According to a 1993 report published by the National Academies, pesticides in the diets of infants and children. Prior to the publication of this report, all environmental regulation in the U.S. focused on assessing probable threats to adults without addressing the distinctive risks faced by infants, children, or any other susceptible group among the population. Comparative to adults, children are exposed to more toxic chemicals per pound of body weight. Since children play on the ground and engage in hand-to-mouth activity, they are more likely to come into contact with toxic chemicals. Considering that children have biological systems and organs at varying stages of development, they must be recognized as a vulnerable population. Chronic illnesses are among the leading causes of sickness, disability, and death among children in the U.S. today, and the prevalence of many of these diseases is high and increasing. Environmental exposures are estimated to be a factor in 17% of pediatric deaths in developed nations and 24% in developing nations, according to the World Health Organization. Physical, chemical, and biological hazards in the environment are a major cause of disease at the global level, accounting for more than a quarter of the global disease burden, and 36% of all deaths among children are due to them. Nearly 100,000 children under 5 die annually from chemical, physical, and biological exposure to environmental hazards in the Americas, according to the Pan American Health Organization. Children of color and those living in poverty bear even greater health consequences than those who are white or wealthy. Children may encounter hazardous chemicals through their environment, such as living in a polluted area or consuming contaminated food. In school and childcare settings, environmental hazards are not adequately regulated, tracked, or remedied. There is also no federal agency to supervise. Some household products that could be hazardous if accessible to a toddler include shower weights, which can contain cobalt, cleaners and detergent pods, bleach, furniture oils, and polishes, or button batteries that could possibly hold corrosive agents. The likelihood of living near a Superfund site is higher in lower income neighborhoods and communities of color, where hazardous chemicals are most likely to be found. A child's exposure to toxic environmental substances can be caused by the built environment if the home or school itself is contaminated or situated in a hazardous area. For instance, near an industrial or agricultural concern, toxic waste site, a smelter, or an electrical power plant. Food can include metals, pesticides, PCSBs, PFAs, and other compounds. Humans are exposed to a multitude of non-chemical stressors in addition to the various synthetic chemicals we are exposed to daily in our environments. There has been a desire for the combined evaluation of chemical and non-chemical exposures in human populations since the 1980s, with the advent of the environmental justice movement. This urgency stems from an environmental justice standpoint of the awareness that ambient chemical burdens disproportionately affect at-risk populations who may also be subjected to significant non-chemical stressors such as poverty and emotional stress. Marginalized populations may be exposed to synthetic chemicals and non-chemical stressors for various reasons. Food insecurity puts children at greater risk of eating canned foods and processed foods, which may lead to higher levels of bisphenol and phthalate metabolites. Some minority and low-income populations are exposed to food additives at disproportionate rates. Childhood chemical exposure is a major health hazard in addition to occupational risk for child laborers in low and middle-income countries. Chemicals of concern that cause harm to children's health include bisphenol, also known as BPA, phthalates, and pesticides. In the 1960s, the use of bisphenols as food additives began to increase after polycarbonate plastics and polymeric metal can coatings were identified as useful ingredients using BPA. Recent legislation has banned BPA from infant bottles, and plastic beverage containers are increasingly labeled BPA free. Nevertheless, BPA is still used to prevent corrosion of food and beverage containers using polymeric resin coatings. In addition, there is public concern about chemical substances contained in plastic toys that may be harmful to humans, including BPA. Children potentially exposed to BPA early in life are at risk of asthma, endocrine disruption, impaired neurodevelopment, and possibly cardiometabolic disorders. Moreover, there is stronger evidence today than previously identified showing cognitive deficits and attention deficit disorders in children exposed to BPA during prenatal development. Phthalates are used in various products and can be classified into two categories. Low molecular weight phthalates are commonly used in shampoos, cosmetics, and lotions, while high molecular weight phthalates are used to manufacture thermoplastics for various applications, including flooring, clear food packaging, and flexible plastic tubing commonly found in food processing. It has been observed that phthalates adversely affect the development of the male genital system in fetuses. Exposure to phthalates in early life is linked to endocrine disruption, allergic diseases, distorted neural development, and reduced and anogenital distance in male infants and preterm birth. Phthalates are best recognized for the anti-androgenic properties, but phthalates may also affect other endocrine pathways such as thyroid and estrogen, as well as induce inflammation and oxidative stress. Minorities and disadvantaged populations are more likely to accumulate phthalate metabolites due to their sources of exposure. Globally, an estimated 70% of child laborers work in agriculture, handling pesticides, mixing chemicals, and spraying them. Researchers discovered the potential adverse effects of pesticide on reproductive, neurological, and carcinogenic outcomes, especially for children and pregnant women. Types of pesticides and recommendations for their use have changed. Autistic disorders are also thought to be caused by exposure to environmental contaminants such as pesticides, heavy metals, PCSBs, PBDAEs, and biological agents. Environmental contaminants such as toxic metals, air pollution, and pesticides have been shown to negatively affect brain development in children based on epidemiological evidence. The neurotoxic effects of toxic metals are evident in considering the neurotoxicity damages the structure and function of the central nervous system, and organophosphate pesticides are an example of neurotoxicants. Worldwide, there are several regulations that limit and control the use of chemical additives in plastic toys or potentially toxic chemicals in general. In Europe, the Toy Safe Directive regulates the use of chemicals in toys and childcare products. The directive restricts the use of more than 70 substances such as phthalates, fragrances, and reducing agents. North American legislation regulates phthalates plasticizer by the Consumer Product Safety Act in Canada and the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act in the US. Other countries, for instance, Egypt and Japan, also have regulations in place to regulate the use of phthalates additives. In addition, some banned and toxic additives are still discovered in plastic toys, which can occur while recycling contaminated plastics due to a lack of knowledge by producers or because the country where the toys are produced does not have the proper legislation. National occupational safety and health boards have developed occupational exposure limits for adults in some settings, but many low-income and middle-income countries have limited capacity to implement and monitor occupational exposure limits for adults, and they are not pertinent to children. Priority should be given to developing child toxin thresholds, like occupational exposure limits and biological exposure indices. Acute as well as prolonged low-level exposures should be considered when determining thresholds. Several studies have referred to adult toxic threshold levels, but children's toxic levels are likely to be considerably lower. Even though in a perfect world, hazardous child labor would not exist, there are no straightforward solutions to this complex societal issue. A ban on child labor can have detrimental effects such as increasing the prevalence of child labor. By integrating toxicity and chemical composition data with high throughput exposure screening methods, it is possible to classify harmful chemicals in plastic materials and evaluate substitutions. Reducing the new number of toys introduced into households every year can reduce exposure to important chemicals found in plastic toys. Regarding pesticides, efforts have focused on safer pesticides for the home and mitigating the effects of harsher pesticides used on agricultural crops. A dose response evaluation involves the possibility of toxicity and any harmful health outcomes during all developmental stages, based on knowledge of external exposure, critical windows of development for different organ systems, information on mode of action, anatomy, physiology, and behavior that can affect external exposure and internal dose metrics. Environmental contamination can harm children's health, and the protection of children's health must transcend the primarily consideration of average exposure levels and encompass a short, medium, and long-term consequences of that exposure. To better analyze children's exposures, it is better to organize the risk assessment approach involving the last four steps, including hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment involving activity patterns and environmental concentrations, and risk characterization. Efforts to enhance the steps of the human risk assessment method will improve the overall risk estimation for children. Synthetic chemicals pose adverse health effects for children. It is crucial to use a framework that observes the built, natural, and social environment while taking an approach to reduce children's exposure to toxic synthetic chemicals. Most studies have examined the health impact of a single chemical exposure or class of chemicals, but it is becoming more apparent that chemical exposures are often associated with other non-chemical stressors such as emotional stressors. It is significant to consider this when thinking of new strategies and approaches to address children's increased risk of synthetic chemicals. Other approaches should include the risk assessment approach, hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. It is important to have public health professionals and community leaders go to underserved communities and rural areas where communities are exposed to pesticides. They can provide education so they can better understand the risk of pesticide exposure and know how to best protect themselves. An approach could be to implement integrated pest management, which is a pest control method that allows for optimal pest damage management with minimal risk to people, property, and environment. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you.